Hey everybody, today we're going to be making chicken tacos. So if you take a look at your recipe, you'll notice that it's broken down into about 3 separate parts. Okay, so the first part is going to be getting the chicken ready. The second part is going to be to prepare your coleslaw mix. And then the last part is going to be making up the dough for your tortillas. It doesn't really matter which one you start with. I usually start with the chicken just because I want it to marinate for a little bit of extra time. And then I'll move on to making the dough and then making the coleslaw. Okay, I make the dough second just because I want it to rest a little bit, because when I roll it out, if it's too tough, it's going to be difficult to try and roll them out really thin. Okay, so remember, we're making tortillas, so we want them to be rolled out as thin as possible before we pan fry them. Okay, so we'll start off by getting all of our ingredients ready and seasoning the chicken. Okay, so I have everything I need out here. So the first one is going to be the cilantro. Okay, so I need 2 tablespoons of chopped cilantro. So whenever you buy it, it's going to come in a bunch like this. And what you want to do is just grab each piece and then just pull the leaves off. Okay, the only thing we want from this is going to be the leaves. So I already have a nice little pile started. Figure that should about do it. I used about 12 to 16 I guess branches of cilantro. So now I'm just going to roughly chop it. Again, this will work similar to what we usually do with garlic, where I'll just hold on to the tip and then use my other hand to guide it. We'll just cut back and forth to chop this up. Okay, so make sure you keep gathering it together. You don't want it to spread out too much from you, otherwise it'll be hard to get to cut. So you'll notice that as you do this, you're going to reduce the size of this pile a little bit, so it's really going to shrink down. And it's difficult to really gauge how much cilantro you need. So it always says something like, oh, you need a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons or a quarter of a cup or something like that. And you'll get a little bit better at estimating as you go along. But for the most part, just start out small. If you need some more, then you can just chop it up and go from there. So if you have a little bit more or a little bit less, it's not going to affect the flavor a whole lot. Okay. Cilantro is a pretty strongly flavored herb, so if you are out by a little bit, it doesn't make a big difference. Okay, so that's probably good. So all I'm going to do is gather that up, and I'm going to put that into this bowl. Okay, so I'm going to get all of my ingredients in this bowl, and then I'm going to add the chicken to it. So the next thing is it asks for the zest of 1 lime and the juice of 1 lime. Okay, so when you're zesting something, this is the type of thing that you would use. If you don't have one of these, which is pretty normal, a lot of people don't generally have these, you can always use a cheese grater on the fine blade. This is what a normal cheese grater blade looks like. Those are going to be really thick, so you want to use this one instead because that's going to be fine. Okay, you just have to be careful when you're grating the lime. You don't want to have too much of the white showing. What you're trying to do is get most of the green off and not have very much yellow. Okay, so I'm just going to go over that. Okay, so you just want to keep doing that to the whole surface. You can see here I'm just getting the green bits of it, and I'm just lightly skinning the surface. Okay, so just continue grating the top of that, and then once we're done, we can cut it in half and juice it. Okay, so I've finished grating most of the rind off of here, so I have it all in there. So I'll just, again, add that to my bowl. Now, if you don't have a grater or a rasp or any way to finally get that off of your lime, just leave it out. Okay, the point of having the lime rind in there is that it gives it a really nice punch of lime flavor. Okay, so if it's not in there, you can try adding a little bit more lime juice just to make it a little more limey. We want to cut it in half this way. Okay, this way doesn't work as well just because it's going to be longer and more shallow and it's hard to juice. Okay, so I'll cut it this way. If you have a juicer like this works out really well. All I'm going to do is put this on here and then just grind it in. Okay, that's going to break up all the citrus in here, and then it'll gather all the juice at the bottom. Okay, and you want to just kind of mash it up the best that you can. You're trying to break up as much of the tissue inside as possible because that's where all the juices are. Okay. So that's one. All right, so as you go along, just give it a nice little extra squeeze at the end. Try and get a little bit more of that juice out. All we need now is the juice from that. So if I can take this lid off carefully because it's full of juice. Yeah, so that whole thing is full of juice. And I'll just put that in here. There we go. Great. So our next ingredient is half a teaspoon of sugar. All right, so I'll grab my half teaspoon. Make sure it's nice and level. After that, we have 1 teaspoon of dry oregano. We'll grab that. Okay, and it calls for 1 tablespoon of olive oil. Okay, you can be careful here and pour the olive oil over into my spoon over the bowl. Oops. There we go. There we go. And the last thing that we need for this is going to be 2 cloves of garlic. So remember that this whole thing is a head of garlic, so when I need 2 cloves, I just need 2 pieces. Okay, so there's 1 and there's 2. So whenever you have garlic, the skin is always on there really well, and it's really annoying to try and peel as it is because you end up with just all these little small pieces coming off. So what I tend to do is just get my knife and give it a little hit. Okay, once you break it, the skin comes off a lot easier. Okay, so all you want to do here is cut off this root end on both pieces, and then holding it carefully, you're just gonna cut it into some smaller slices. Okay, so remember that while you're doing this, you want to curl your fingers in and then just use a slow rocking motion to cut it. Okay, keep your fingers curled because that will keep the blade away from your fingertips. Okay, so I was able to cut really close just because of that hand curl. Okay, so again. So now that we have some smaller, thinner slices, I'm going to do the same thing I did with the cilantro. Okay, hold the tip and just go back and forth with it. Again, this is a very common way of mincing garlic. And mincing is just to cut it into very small pieces. Okay, we'll look at in a minute what that's going to look like. Okay, so here I'm using the same cutting board just because all of these ingredients are currently going to be mixed together, so I'm not too concerned about any of the flavors or colors bleeding over as I'm cutting this up. Okay, so as you go, just keep gathering it together. If you get a lot on your knife, you can just use your finger to pull it off. Okay, so keep it in a little pile, and then just keep going back and forth until you have it all chopped up. Okay, the idea here, you want it to be as small as possible so that there's going to be a lot of little pieces floating around. Yeah, it's going to make it so that you're able to flavor your meat a lot more effectively. All right, so let's say that's about good. So whenever you're looking for minced garlic, this is about the consistency that you're looking for. Okay, so we'll just add that. Again, to our bowl. Right. So the last thing that we have is the actual chicken. So before you do that, just clean up your area a little bit. Right, so now that everything's a little bit more tidy, I can start cutting up my chicken. So the recipe calls for 1.5 pounds. This is about right. It's going to be a little bit extra, but that's okay. And what I'm going to do, a lot of recipes will recommend that you just throw the chicken breasts in the way that they are. But what I like to do instead is just cut it into smaller pieces. Okay, so what that looks like, okay, just cut it into some smaller strips and then cut these strips into small pieces. Okay, the reason I do this is because this will make it cook faster. Okay, so if I'm trying to cook this giant piece of meat, it's going to take a long time for the heat to penetrate all the way through and cook it up to 165 degrees. Okay, if I have pieces that are only this big, they're going to go a lot faster. Okay, the other reason is that if I throw this into the marinade, it's only going to marinate the outer surface. Okay, but if I have a bunch of small pieces, it still does the outer surface, but there's so many of them that it becomes more well marinated than just the large pieces. Okay, so once you got those, just throw that in and then finish cutting up the rest. Alright, so once you're done, this is what you should have. So just a nice bowl of cut up chicken, and then just grab a spoon and mix it together. Okay. I forgot to mention that chicken is one of those meats that has a lot of bacteria in it. Okay, so salmonella is going to be a big concern here. So what you want to do is when you wash your dishes and wipe down your counter, whatever your soap water is, add a little bit of bleach to it just to try and kill the bacteria. Okay, so once you have this all mixed up, that should be good. Cover this with plastic wrap or put it into a container with a lid and put it in the refrigerator. Okay, so we're just going to let this sit and marinate while we work on the tortilla dough and then the coleslaw. Right, so our next step is going to be to work on the tortilla dough. So you can just skip this step if you instead want to just buy yourself a pack of tortillas or hard shell tacos or whatever. But if you don't want to spend the money on that, I'll show you how to make these from basic ingredients. Okay, so I have my 3 cups of flour here. To that, I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of salt and 1 teaspoon of baking powder. Okay, make sure this is full, but level off the top. Okay, so scoop it out and then just use something, so a chopstick or a butter knife or something like that to smooth it off. So there's my 1 teaspoon. And my next thing is going to be 1 teaspoon of salt. Okay. So now what you want to do is take a whisk or a fork or something like that and just mix those ingredients together. Okay, I want the baking powder to be well distributed so that there's going to be an even amount throughout the dough. Okay, the baking powder is going to be important to get it to rise a little bit, make it a little bit lighter. So I want to make sure that's mixed in. Okay, so the next part of this asks you to add 1 cup of water and then 1/3 cup of olive oil. Okay, so I'm going to add 1 cup of water. And I'm going to use this to measure out 1/3 cup of olive oil. So whenever you're using a liquid measuring cup, the measures are on the side here, so I need to go to 1/3. So what you want to do is put this down, pour it, but look at it from the side. Okay, I want to see at what point this is going to be even. Okay, so that is how you would measure using that. We'll put that in. Right, and in the instructions it tells you to use the dough hook to mix it. So if you have a stand mixer, what you would want to do is use this attachment here. Okay, this is the one that works the best for doughs. So if you don't use that, what you want instead is to grab a wooden spoon or some sort of mixing tool that's going to be really strong and isn't going to break easily, because this dough can get fairly stiff. Okay, so I'm just going to mix this together until it gets to the right consistency. Right, so this is what it looks like after a couple of minutes of mixing. It's mostly together, but you can see that there's still some loose flour. Okay, it's getting to the point where it's hard to mix with the wooden spoon, so I'm just going to do it by hand. I'm just going to fold it over. So this is what you would call kneading, and usually you would do this on the counter, but I'm trying to clean up what's in the bowl here before I move it onto the counter. Okay, so as you go through, you'll notice that there's parts of it that are dry and parts of it that are sticky. So this here is a little bit sticky, so I'm going to use that to try and pick up some of the flour on the bottom. So you really want to try and utilize all of the dough, or all the flour and all the ingredients that were in the bowl. So the bowl should come out fairly clean. Okay, so this is good. I'm just going to set this aside and I'm going to start kneading it. So to knead the dough, you just want to fold it over and then push down. Okay, then turn, fold over, push down, turn, fold, push. Okay, so you want to just keep working it from different directions. And this is what you do to try and strengthen the gluten. Okay, so we want to have this worked very nicely so that it's able to keep its own structure. So you basically want to keep doing this until it forms a smooth dough. Okay, you can feel it's still a little rough, so just keep mixing that. All right, and the more you do this, the faster you'll be able to do it. So the turns and the folds will just come naturally after a while. All right, so here it's starting to tear a little bit, so I'll just let it rest. So I'm just going to roll this into a ball. I'm going to end up putting this back into the bowl. Okay, so I'll put that back in here. I'm just going to cover that with a cloth to let it rest. Okay, it doesn't have to rise or anything like that. It just has to relax the glutens. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to roll it out. Okay, so while I'm waiting for that, I'm going to start working on the coleslaw. So in order to do the coleslaw, it's actually very simple. You basically just have to mix all the ingredients together and then let it sit. So I have this 3-color coleslaw that comes in a 14-ounce bag. Just going to use the whole thing for this. So I'll just dump that in there. If you don't want to buy a coleslaw mix, there's not really a lot to it. So when you look at this is basically just shredded white cabbage, some red cabbage, and then carrots. So that's all there is to the mix. All right, so to that, I got my, actually what I'm going to do instead, I'm going to mix all of this together in a separate bowl. And that's going to make it so that I have like a even mix, and then I can add it onto the coleslaw to coat it. Because otherwise, if I just start adding it randomly, I'm going to have some things with a lot of lemon juice, some parts are going to have a little bit of lemon juice, so this will just be better. Okay, so here's my half a cup of mayonnaise, some mayonnaise. Okay, and then I need 2 tablespoons of sugar. Okay, the sweetness from this and the saltiness from the salt is going to help balance out the tartness you get from having vinegar and lemon juice in there. Okay, so I need 1.5 tablespoons of lemon juice. Okay, so 1 tablespoon. That's a half. Okay. We need 1 tablespoon of vinegar. Okay, so 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Okay, that means you basically just need like a little pinch of it, so just measure out in your hand a little bit. So that should do for 1/4. So throw that in there. And then we need 1/2 teaspoon of ground black pepper. So if you have a bag of pepper that's already ground, that's a lot easier to measure out. I just have one of these dispensers, so I have to go by what my eye says. So that's about 1/2 teaspoon. Okay, so that's all the ingredients. Now I just have to mix these together. Right, if you have a whisk or a fork or something like that, that'll probably work the best for mixing this together. And then once you have it all, just pour this on top. There we go. So originally the recipe says to use 2 cups of this mix and then add these ingredients to it, but I feel like that was probably enough for the whole bag. Okay, so, and the bag was probably about 4 cups. You don't want to have a big pool of liquid on the bottom. Okay, so now that I have that done, I'm just going to refrigerate that and let it sit in the fridge. Okay, the next thing that I need to work on is going to be the tortillas again. So I need to portion them out and then roll them out and fry them. Okay, the very last thing that you're going to do is the chicken, because the chicken really only takes about 10 minutes to cook, especially now that we've cut it up into some smaller pieces. So our next step here is going to be to portion out our dough. Okay, so in the recipe it asks for this dough to be broken up into 16 equal portions. I find that's a little bit small. The tortillas end up being about 6 inches, so they're only about this big. I prefer mine to be a little bit bigger, so I'm going to break it up into 10 portions instead. Okay, so what I want to do here, I have a kitchen scale. I want to weigh out how much my dough is. The easiest way for me is to measure it in grams. So this dough is 794 grams, so that means that if I want this to be in 10 equal pieces, each piece would be 79 grams. Okay, so take this out, and then I'm just going to start cutting it up. Okay, so 79, too much. There, okay. So you just want to keep measuring them out and then make sure that they're as close as possible. Okay, if you don't have a kitchen scale, all you want to do is take your dough and just stretch it out so that it's long, and then just cut it into equal pieces. Okay, so however many equal pieces that you're going to make. All right, so go ahead and portion those out. So once you have these all broken up into your 10 pieces, what you want to do now is round them. Okay, so you want to try and roll these into balls. And the reason for that is your tortillas are supposed to be round. And the easiest way to do that is if you're already starting off with something with a round shape. Okay, so there's 2 ways of doing this. One is if you take your dough, just bend and pinch. Okay, turn it 90 degrees. Take that and pinch. Okay, so just keep doing that until you can smooth off the top. Okay, once you smooth the top, you just want to form a circle with your fingers and just pinch that together. Okay, so now you have a little round. Okay, the other way of doing this, you want to start off that way as well, but when you put it down, you just kind of roll it with your hands, and then you want to tuck it in with your fingers, like so. Okay. This way is a lot easier to do once you get the hang of it, but this is a technique that's difficult to learn. Okay, so this one is now circular. Right. Either way that you do it, it's like once you get the hang of it, you can do it with two hands, and you really start to feel it come together too. So the idea here, you want to turn these into small dough balls, and then you just want to let them rest a little bit again. Okay, so we're constantly getting the dough to rest because we don't want it to get too tough. Once it gets really tough, then it's harder to roll out, and then you're not going to have a good time. Okay, so try and make it easy on yourself. Let it rest, and only roll it out after it's done that. Okay, so this is the last 10. Now that I have these all balled up, I'm just going to cover them with a tea towel so that they don't dry out, and then I'll give it about, say, 15 minutes, and then I'll start rolling these out individually and then frying them in the pan. Right, so we'll just let these rest for 15 minutes. It's been 15 minutes. Let's take a look at the dough balls. Okay, so I'm gonna have to roll these out one by one, so I'm just gonna give myself enough space for that. What you want to do is get your pan started. So I have a pan heating on the stove over medium heat. So grab a little bit of flour next and just lightly dust this countertop space, and then coat your dough ball. Okay, so here got my rolling pin, and you want to roll these out until they're about 1/8 to 1/16 of an inch thick. Okay, so that's going to be very thin, but I'll show you exactly what that looks like. Okay, it should be about, I'd say, 8 or 9 inches in diameter. Okay, so and make sure you try and keep this round shape. Okay, every time you have one of these, you can go ahead and throw it on the stove. Okay, so it's about 45 seconds to 1 minute per side. And you just want to cook them so that there's light brown spots on it. Okay, you don't want to get them too brown, otherwise they're going to be dried up and will stick together. Okay, so this right here is a pretty good thickness. You can see it's pretty thin. That's what we're looking for. Okay, so if you have some extra flour on there, just try and brush some of that off. Okay, so I'm going to put this into the frying pan, and while it's going, I can get started on the next one. All right, so just keep this process going until you've done all of your dough. So one of the things that you want to do is make sure you have a plate to put these on. Right? And what I do is I stack them on top of each other while they're still warm. And what that's going to do is trap in some of the moisture, and it's going to make sure that they don't dry out. And that's important when you're making tacos, or tortillas in this case. It's important that you make sure that they don't dry out too much, because once they get dry, they're brittle. And then when you try and fold them, they're just going to crack, and then all the stuff that you have on the inside is going to fall out, and then it's just going to be a big mess. Okay, if you find that it's sticking like it was just now, add a little bit more flour on there. Flour is actually very slippery, so it makes it so that you don't stick to the surface. If you've ever spilled a little bit of flour on the ground, you'll notice that it is very slippery. Okay, so looking at my dough, there we go. So it's starting to just puff up a little bit. So what I'm going to do with that, you have two options. So grab a pair of tongs, or you can just grab a flipper. So I'll grab the flipper. Let's flip that over. Okay. It hasn't really browned, so I still have some time. I'm just going to keep letting this cook and then wait for it to brown up a little bit, and then I'll take it off. Alright, so it's time to cook the chicken. I'm almost done with the tortillas. As you go along, if you notice that they're starting to puff up, it's okay. What you can do, if you're really concerned about it, just poke a little hole in there, and then you can use that to deflate some of the steam. Okay. So we'll put the last one on, and while that's cooking, this has been heating up, so this should be about ready to go. So we'll just add the chicken in. Now, we're basically going to want to cook this until it reaches 165 degrees Fahrenheit. So the best way to check that is if you have a kitchen thermometer, you just stick that in there once they're fully cooked. Otherwise, if you don't have one, you're just going to have to use your best guess. Okay, so once the chicken is done, it should be very firm, and if you break it open, there will be no pink spots, and any juices coming out of it should be completely clear. Alright, so here's the chicken. When I first added it in and started cooking it, there was a huge amount of liquid that came out of it. And as it turns out, by the time the liquid was done cooking out of it, the chicken was done. Okay, so if you look at it, it breaks apart really easy. If you look at the inside, it's nice and white, there's no pink spots, so this chicken is good to go. And here we are all done. Okay, so here's the slaw that we made. You know, give it a good stir. Okay, there's still a little bit of liquid that made it to the bottom, so I definitely had more than enough to cover the whole thing. Okay, I got my homemade tortillas. Okay, here's our chicken. And for the sauce, it was just a mixture that was equal parts of ranch dressing and salsa. So just put those together and mix it and you're good. And we're ready to eat.